I think that, I am a lawyer practicing in this area, and I work with organizations through their life cycle, starting out and, right through winding them up. And so I just think it's a good idea to give a bit of a legal framework for how we operate in this world. And I would like to start by saying that in our brainstorming session on board matters, there was a lot of really interesting discussion about, alternatives to the status quo. And it was kind of revolutionary and I think very healthy. But at the same time, I'm not sure that we should necessarily indulge in that now because, there is a legal sort of environment we live in, and that I think is where the rubber hits the road for most of you. But I would like to acknowledge that, people are interested in alternatives and coming up with models that work for them that they aren't sort of finding out there now. And I'm all for that, but I'm just not sure that this is the forum for it. So I want to start like 30,000 feet out and zoom in. And I know a lot of you have a lot of experience, and what I'm about to say is going to be familiar, but sort of go along with me so that we're all sort of bringing the data with us throughout the evening's discussion. Each of us is an individual. Many of us are artists or other professionals in our careers, and we get together with others. As a starting point, when groups form, they're unincorporated. They're unincorporated associations of people. And because what we're doing isn't business, it's viewed as not-for-profit and possibly charitable. So we sort of look, in a legal sense, at the Income Tax Act for how to treat those individuals. And most people don't want to pay tax. So when you look at the Income Tax Act, there's not-for-profit organization. A not-for-profit organization could be an unincorporated, association of people. It could be a corporation. But it's basically treating a group of people for income tax purposes, and that sort of non-tax designation is what they want. To be a not-for-profit organization, you don't have to be incorporated. Okay, so you don't really need a board necessarily. If you are a charity, then some different sort of things apply. But just starting with the not-for-profit, the conditions are really that you're not a charity, and that you're set up not to make a profit, that you don't actually make a profit, and that there's no benefit to the members. And so when I say members, I sort of come back to that group of people that had formed in the first place. And those people, will have to face sort of decisions in their experience together, whether or not to do this or that, i.e. incorporate or, form a charity. But there are a number of reasons why groups sort of make the choices that they do. But for tax purposes, we're essentially talking about a group of people coming together without a view of making a profit. Now, in the vast majority of cases, groups incorporate. And this is where we sort of got a lot of pushback because people didn't like the corporate laws that were imposed on them. And I get that. But the reason why that occurs in our world is because as individuals, we don't want to take the responsibility for the organization. We got our own personal taxes and problems. We don't want to take that on for the organization. So as soon as you start to get into a situation where you want to, perhaps contract, maybe you want to hire someone. Well, how do you do that if you don't want to do that as an individual? Well, you have to form an entity, okay? If you want to, sign a lease, if you, get into disputes, and you want to sue, or maybe someone wants to sue you. Well, all that sort of requires an entity to be formed. And the way that is done in the vast majority of cases is through incorporation. There's an alternative model which is by trust, and I think some of you may have encountered trusts in your volunteerism or in your organizations, but it's not the typical model for not-for-profit organizations anyway. It may be for charities, and it's not generally what is used for organizations that are operating, like I think most arts organizations are. So in almost all cases, your organizations will face a point in time when your lawyer is telling you to incorporate. And that's because you need to contract and you need to deal with the legal framework. And with that comes the corporate law. It could be a federal law, it could be a provincial law, depending on where you're operating and what suits your organization. And those laws essentially create a paradigm where you've got members, which are essentially the shareholders, and directors, which are the board. And then there may be officers, which could be the directors, or those could be outside people. And you've got management, the people that the board hires to carry on the activities day to day. So you've got this general framework, and the laws give you guidance on in some cases, what you must do, and in other cases, what you may do. So not all of you actually need a board. Like if you're an unincorporated association of people doing your thing, you can invent your own model. And so if you don't have to open a bank account, which requires you to have, to be incorporated, well then, fine, don't incorporate. If you don't need to be incorporated for your landlord or because you want to hire employees and you can manage this individually, well then, that's okay. But I don't think that's what most of you are dealing with. I think most of you are dealing with corporate laws, either federally or provincially, and with boards and bylaws and so on and so forth. So that's why we're going to talk about things for the most part, in that context. Now, just a note about charities. Registered, so the not-for-profit is one designation in the Income Tax Act, I mentioned, and that means you're not paying tax. And again, one of the first conditions to be a not-for-profit is that you're not a charity. Okay? If, for example, and I want to mention something called common law, because, for example, there's no statute that actually establishes what is a charity. That's common law. That's been formed by the judges over time. And so there is a risk, just sort of out there, that if, for example, you think you're a not-for-profit, but your objects, your purpose in your documents is actually charitable, but you're not registered as a charity, you could actually be taxable. So there's the not-for-profit organization and the registered charity. In between, there may be a charity that thinks it's a not-for-profit, but isn't. It's actually charitable based on the common law definition. I know that may be confusing, but let me just come back to the point that the first condition of a not-for-profit is that you're not a charity. And so what a lot of not-for-profits do is they take a poison pill. And that means that they do something that charities are forbidden from doing, which is political advocacy. Okay? So if you're a not-for-profit, you have certain parameters. If you are a registered charity, then you could still be unincorporated, you can be a trust, and you can be a corporation. So there's different sort of legal entities that the Canada Revenue Agency Charities Director will recognize. So that's sort of the Income Tax Act stuff, and we don't need to go on about that. But that's, what most arts organizations will consider, what legal entity to take, whether or not they're going to be a not-for-profit or a registered charity. So that's the framework we're living in. Now, the rest of my remarks will really be in the context of incorporation and the different stakeholders, okay? So you've got members, directors, officers, managers. The people that formed your organization, your corporation, were the first directors. If it was an Ontario corporation, they would have also been the first members. But without getting too caught up in that, the first incorporators became the first directors. They admit members. And then those members are responsible on an ongoing basis for electing the board. So it's this framework that we operate in, and then the board hires management. A lot of you may actually be, executive directors or employees of your organizations, and you might think that you're in control. But I'll tell you, the board is in control, and they're accountable to ultimately to the corporation, but to the members. And if the members don't like the board, then they could remove them or elect different people in the future. Now, you might ask, well, who are your members? And how is all this happening? Unfortunately, a lot of you probably inherited your organizations. But all of this is really clearly spelled out, or should be, in your governing documents. You'll have letters patent or articles of incorporation, and you'll have bylaws. And those documents, even though you may never look at them, are actually really important. And when we work with clients, we spend a lot of time developing structures that work for the organization. So you might want a mass membership, where you've got members across the country. Maybe you want a really tightly held group, or even just one person, or maybe it's another corporation that's setting up a sister organization and they want control. But so those, things can all be defined by the people setting up the organization. And in your cases, you may be able to recreate, organizational documents, to reflect how you want things, providing the existing stakeholders go with the flow. But ultimately, boards play a very important role because they are responsible. They are responsible and, in many cases, liable for the corporation. So even though the staff is the one out there running the things day to day, it's the board who's delegated that responsibility to the management. And in doing so, they haven't actually delegated their liability. They've just delegated the duties. And they're still ultimately on the hook. Out of the textbook that I use, the role of the board can be divided into the following broad categories. And I like the way that they summarize this, so I'm just going to read it. 1, to manage the affairs of the corporation. 2, to ensure that the objects, purposes of the corporation are properly carried out and to further the organization's objects, purposes. To set long-range objectives and to develop strategic plans. To establish policies and guidelines for the operation of the corporation. To be responsible for all aspects of the corporation's operations. To ensure the corporation's financial stability and assess performance. To evaluate the performance of the corporation, to establish policies and short-term goals, and finally to communicate the needs of the community to the corporation and to represent the corporation and its financial needs to the community. So that, in my opinion, is a general framework for our discussion. Your arts organizations, some of you may be not-for-profit organizations, some of you may be registered charities, you may be unincorporated, you may be incorporated. I think that all of you will have a board, a group that is hiring the managers to carry out the day-to-day activities, and that group, the board, is ultimately responsible for the corporation and assumes its liabilities.